the liberation of Israel and the parting of the Red Sea. There was a time when God's people lived in the shadows of slavery. 400 long years passed under the scorching sun of Egypt, where men bent their backs under the weight of mud bricks, where women cradled their children to the sound of cracking whips, where hope seemed a distant, almost forgotten memory. But God does not forget. He hears the cry of the oppressed. And when the appointed time came, He raised up a liberator. This is the story of Moses and the greatest miracle of liberation ever witnessed by humanity. Egypt was a land of extreme contrasts. On one side, the majestic palaces of Pharaoh stood imposingly on the banks of the Nile River, with their gigantic columns decorated with golden hieroglyphs, their spacious halls, where the cool breeze circulated between curtains of fine linen, their gardens perfumed with lotus flowers that floated in tanks of crystal-clear water. Pharaoh, the god-man of the Egyptians, lived surrounded by unparalleled luxury, served by hundreds of slaves who bowed before his presence. On the other side, in the work fields that stretched across the fertile Nile Valley, the Hebrews suffered. In the brickyards, the heat was unbearable. The brick kilns burned day and night, filling the air with thick, acrid smoke. Men with sun-bronzed skin, calloused and wounded hands, mixed clay with straw, molding bricks under the constant watch of Egyptian overseers wielding braided leather whips. The crack of these whips echoed through the fields like thunderclaps of cruelty. The women also worked. They carried water in heavy clay jars from the river to the construction sites, climbing steep ramps under a sun that seemed to burn their very souls. Their simple dresses of coarse linen were soaked with sweat. Their children grew up breathing dust and seeing their parents humiliated daily. At night, in the modest adobe dwellings, exhausted families gathered. Their homes were simple: mud brick walls, low roofs made of straw and reeds, and dirt floors. A small, flickering oil lamp illuminated faces marked by suffering. There, the elders told stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They spoke of ancient promises, of a land flowing with milk and honey, of a God who had not forgotten them. But the years dragged on. Generations were born and died in slavery. And hope, like a flame without oil, began to fade. It was then that God appeared to Moses in a burning bush in the desert of Midian. The desert was a vast ocean of golden sand and reddish stones, where the silence was broken only by the wind whistling between the rocky ravines. There, far from the oppression of Egypt, Moses had become a shepherd, accustomed to the solitude of the arid mountains, to the immense, starry sky of the desert nights. When God called him to liberate Israel, Moses hesitated. But no argument can prevail against the divine call. God sent him back to Egypt with his brother Aaron, and there, before Pharaoh's golden throne, amidst the gigantic columns adorned with images of Egyptian gods, Moses declared, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go." Pharaoh, seated on his high throne, with his golden scepter and his double crown representing Upper and Lower Egypt, looked at those two Hebrews with disdain. "Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice? I do not know the Lord, nor will I let Israel go." Then the plagues began. The majestic Nile, worshipped as a god by the Egyptians, turned to blood. Its waters, normally blue and crystal clear, became red and thick, like coagulated blood. The smell of dead fish filled the air throughout Egypt. Frogs invaded homes, even Pharaoh's private chambers. Lice covered men and animals. Flies formed black clouds that obscured the sun. Egyptian cattle died in the fields, their swollen bodies rotting in the heat. Painful ulcers broke out on the skin of the Egyptians. Hailstones as large as fists fell from the sky with such violence that they shattered trees and killed everything in the fields. Countless locusts covered the land like a living, devouring carpet, until nothing green remained in all of Egypt. Dense, palpable darkness covered the land for 3 days, a darkness so deep that the Egyptians could not see their own hands in front of their faces. And finally, the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn. On that terrible night, a groan rose from all the land of Egypt. There was no house where there was not someone dead. From Pharaoh's palace to the simplest dwellings, the lament was universal. It was on that very night that Israel departed. But what a night it was! In the homes of the Hebrews, there was a feverish, urgent activity. Entire families moved hurriedly by the light of lamps and torches. Women tied clothes into bundles, filled water skins, and sacks with flour. Men gathered their sheep and goats, tied loads to donkeys. Children, frightened by the haste of the adults and the distant sound of Egyptian lamentations, clung to their mothers' garments. "Quick, there's no time." The words ran from house to house. They ate standing up, hurriedly, unleavened bread because there was no time to wait for the dough to rise, hastily roasted meat, bitter herbs that reminded them of the years of suffering. Their loins were girded, their sandals on their feet, their staffs in their hands. They were ready to leave, and when Moses gave the signal, they set out. It was not a small group. The Bible records about 600,000 men, in addition to women and children. Imagine the scene, a crowd of perhaps 2 million people with their flocks, their children, their elderly, moving through the night. The sound was impressive, the bleating of sheep, the lowing of cattle, the braying of donkeys, the crying of babies, the dragging of bare feet on the sand, the clinking of pots and tools, voices calling to one another in the darkness. They left behind the potteries where they had toiled. They left the fields where their ancestors had been buried. They left 400 years of history, a history of pain, but their own history. And they walked toward the unknown. But they were not alone. God went before them in a visible, unmistakable way. During the day, a pillar of cloud. It wasn't an ordinary cloud, one of those you see floating across the sky. It was a vertical, dense column, rising from the earth to the heavens, white as snow, majestic, imposing. It moved ahead of the people, showing them the way. And when it stopped, the people camped. At night, that same column transformed into fire. Imagine the spectacle, a column of dancing flames, red and gold, illuminating the desert with a supernatural glow. Its light was enough to illuminate the entire camp. Children watched in wonder. Old men murmured in reverence. Never in the entire history of humanity had God manifested himself so visibly, so constantly. He was not just a God who revealed himself at special moments. He was there 24 hours a day, guiding, protecting, manifesting his presence. Meanwhile, in the royal palace in Memphis or Tanis, Pharaoh faced reality. His halls, once filled with pomp and power, now echoed with silence and mourning. His own son, the crown prince, lay dead. But Pharaoh was the lord of Egypt, the God-man. And God-men cannot show weakness. Days passed, and then fury replaced grief. "What have we done?" he roared to his advisors. "We let Israel go, and we lost our servants." The Egyptian nobles, also furious at the loss of their slaves, incited Pharaoh. Egypt's economy depended on those slaves. Who would now build the great works? Who would work in the fields? Pharaoh gave immediate orders. In the royal stables, soldiers prepared 600 chosen war chariots, the best in Egypt. These chariots were fearsome war machines, light, fast, made of curved wood and leather, with 6-spoked wheels reinforced with bronze, pulled by trainable Arabian horses, the fastest and most resilient animals in the ancient world. Each chariot carried 2 men, a driver and a soldier armed with bow, arrows, and spears. But it wasn't just 600 chariots. Pharaoh gathered his entire army, thousands of infantry soldiers with spears, shields, and curved swords. Archers with composite bows capable of firing arrows at great distances. Officers in golden chariots, distinguished by their plumes and insignia. War trumpets sounded throughout Egypt. Pharaoh's wounded pride had become a machine of destruction. Meanwhile, the Israelites had arrived at a place called Pi-Hahiroth, near Baal-Zephon, facing the sea. It was a peculiar geographical position. On one side was the Red Sea, or more precisely, the Sea of Reeds, a stretch of water that extended as far as the eye could see. Its waters were a deep blue, almost black in some places. Waves broke gently on the beach of golden, sand mixed with pebbles. The smell of salt and seaweed filled the air. On the other side, rocky mountains rose up narrow gorges, terrain impossible to traverse with a crowd of that size, especially with herds, children, and the elderly. They were, geographically speaking, in a trap. The camp was immense. Simple tents of coarse fabric stretched for miles. Campfires dotted the landscape like earthly stars. The sound was of a city in motion, women grinding grain, men mending sandals, children playing in the sand, herds grazing on the sparse vegetation, elderly people sitting on rugs talking about the extraordinary events they were witnessing. The column of cloud had stopped. It was time to rest. And then someone shouted, "Look, behind you!" On the desert horizon, a cloud of dust began to form. First small, then growing, widening, approaching with terrifying speed. And then, emerging from that cloud of golden sand, they appeared, the war chariots of Egypt. The sun reflected off the bronze of their wheels, the metal tips of their spears, and the soldiers' armor. The sound came soon after, the thud of thousands of hooves hitting the ground, the creaking of wooden wheels, the soldiers' war cries, the shrill sound of military trumpets. Panic erupted in the Israelite camp like wildfire in dry grass. Women screamed. Men ran to their families. Children cried desperately. Chaos ensued. "We're going to die. We're all going to die." They surrounded Moses in great tumult. Their voices were a mixture of terror, anger, and despair. "Were there no graves in Egypt that you brought us out of there to die in the desert? Why have you done this to us, bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we tell you this in Egypt? Leave us alone so that we may serve the Egyptians? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert." Fear is capable of making the human heart forget miracles. Those people had seen the 10 plagues. They had seen the power of God humble Egypt. They had been spared destruction when the angel of death passed over their homes. They had seen the pillar of cloud and fire. But in the face of imminent danger, memory failed. Present terror erased past victories. But Moses was different. He had spoken with God face to face. He had seen the burning bush. He had held the staff that turned into a serpent. He had stretched out his hand over the Nile and seen it turn to blood. He knew the God he was dealing with. Moses stood up. His voice cut through the panic like a sword cuts through the darkness. "Do not be afraid. Stand firm and see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." What an extraordinary declaration. Surrounded by a terrified crowd, with the most powerful army on earth approaching, with the sea before them and mountains on either side, Moses declared victory. But even Moses, in his heart, cried out to God. And God answered him with a surprising question. "Why do you cry out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. Raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the water so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground." God was not merely promising deliverance. He was commanding a miracle that would defy all the laws of nature. Before anything else happened, something extraordinary occurred. The angel of God, who was going ahead of the Israelite camp in the pillar of cloud, changed position. The entire pillar, that majestic pillar of white cloud rising to the heavens, began to move. Imagine the people's astonishment at seeing that divine presence glide through the air, circling the camp, heading behind them. The pillar of cloud positioned itself between the Israelite camp and the rapidly approaching Egyptian army. For the Egyptians, it was darkness, a supernatural, dense darkness that completely blinded them. Their horses reared up in fright. Their chariots were forced to stop. The soldiers shouted in confusion in the darkness. Pharaoh, in his golden chariot, cursed furiously but could not advance. It was as if a wall of darkness separated them from Israel. But for Israel on the other side, that same cloud gave light. Its face turned towards the chosen people shone, illuminated, comforted. Throughout that night, the cloud kept the two armies separated. The Egyptians could not approach Israel. And then Moses did what God had commanded. With all the people watching, with 2 million eyes fixed on him, Moses approached the shore. The sound of the waves breaking on the sand was rhythmic, constant, indifferent to human drama. The air smelled of salt and seaweed. The dark water of the sea stretched to the horizon, seemingly insurmountable. Moses raised his staff, that shepherd's staff that God had transformed into an instrument of miracles. He stretched out his hand over the sea, and he opened his mouth in prayer, invoking the name of the Lord. At that moment, God acted. A wind began to blow. It was not a gentle breeze. It was a strong wind coming from the east, a wind that made clothes beat violently against bodies, that lifted sand and threw it against faces, that roared like an enraged lion. It was the breath of God, the breath of the Almighty sweeping the waters. And the waters began to move. First, the waves stopped breaking naturally. Then they began to recede. not like a normal, slow, gradual tide, but as if an invisible force were pushing them, dividing them. The waters on the right began to accumulate, rising, forming a liquid wall. The waters on the left did the same, rising, defying gravity, creating a corridor between them. The wind continued to blow with furious force throughout the night. And as it blew, the seabed began to appear. First damp, muddy, full of algae and shells. But the divine wind continued its work. The ground dried, hardened, becoming solid ground. At dawn, the impossible lay before the eyes of Israel, a path through the middle of the sea. The walls of water on both sides rose like buildings of 10, perhaps 15 stories. Through them, one could see the ocean beyond, distorted, trembling. Fish swam within these liquid walls, trapped in supernatural suspension. Algae swayed vertically. The light of the rising sun pierced the waters, creating an ethereal, magical, impossible blue-green glow. And in the middle of the path, dry land firm enough to walk on, wide enough for multitudes. March. Moses shouted, "March in the name of the Lord." But who would be first? Who would dare to take the first step between those walls of water that defied all natural laws? What if the waters fell while they were in the middle? What if it was an illusion? But that's what faith is, taking the first step when you don't see the whole path. Some courageous men, perhaps Caleb and Joshua among them, took the first step. Then others. And then, like a dam breaking, the whole people began to move. It was a procession like no other. Entire families walking along the ocean floor. Small children looked in wonder at the walls of water, pointing to the fish swimming inside. Some adults reached out trembling hands to touch those liquid walls, but recoiled with reverence. The ground beneath their feet was dry, firm, but there were shells and starfish scattered about, evidence that this was, in fact, the ocean floor. The sound was impressive. 2 million feet walking, sheep bleating, donkeys braying, wagon wheels creaking, children crying, others laughing excitedly, parents calling their families to stay together. And above all this, the continuous roar of those two walls of water, a deep, primal sound, as if the ocean itself were groaning at God's command. The walls of water were not smooth. They undulated, trembled, moved in hypnotic patterns, but did not fall. It was as if invisible hands held them up. The sunlight that streamed through those walls created dancing patterns of blue and green light on the ground, making the whole path seem magical, sacred. Elderly people who never imagined seeing such a thing staggered, leaning on canes, tears streaming down their wrinkled faces. Young people ran ahead, then returned to help their families. Mothers carried babies against their chests, whispering prayers of gratitude. Shepherds guided flocks, amazed by the animals' tranquility in that impossible place. It took hours, perhaps all night, and part of the following morning. 2 million people don't cross quickly, no matter how wide the path. But they crossed, all of them, from the first to the last. None were left behind. When the last Israelite family reached the middle of the sea, something changed on the other side. The dark cloud that blinded the Egyptians began to dissipate. With the light of dawn, Pharaoh and his soldiers could finally see. And what they saw filled them with renewed fury. There was the path through the middle of the sea, and there was Israel walking calmly across the other half of the crossing, almost reaching the other shore. Behind them, Pharaoh roared, "They can't escape. They are our slaves." Pride is a poison that blinds reason. Those men had witnessed the 10 plagues. They had seen their own river turn to blood, their crops destroyed, their children killed. And now they saw a sea divided in two by supernatural power. But wounded pride does not accept defeat. The Egyptian war chariots began to enter the path between the waters. The horses, however, were nervous. They hesitated, reared up, sensing that something was deeply wrong there. But the drivers forced them to move forward. First a few chariots, then dozens, then hundreds. The entire Egyptian army entered the seabed. The sound of their wheels echoed strangely among those walls of water. The bronze of their weapons reflected the greenish light that pierced the suspended ocean. They shouted war cries, confident that they would soon reach those runaway slaves. But they were not alone there. God was watching. The Bible says that, in the morning watch, the Lord looked at the Egyptian army through the pillar of fire and cloud. and God disturbed them. Imagine the scene. Suddenly, without warning, the wheels of the chariots began to come loose. Axles broke. Wheels detached and rolled down the sides of the path, falling onto the edges of those walls of water. Horses stumbled, breaking legs. Chariots collided with each other. Soldiers were thrown to the ground. Panic set in. Those battle-hardened warriors who had conquered nations, who were the terror of the entire ancient world, began to scream in fear. "Let's flee from before Israel," they cried in despair. "For the Lord fights for them against the Egyptians." But it was too late to flee. They were in the middle of the sea, surrounded by walls of water on both sides, their chariots broken, their horses wounded, their path blocked by the very confusion they had created. At that moment, the last Israelites stepped onto dry land on the other side of the sea. The entire nation was saved. They turned and looked back, seeing the Egyptian army trapped in that divine snare. And then God spoke to Moses again, "Stretch out your hand over the sea, so that the waters may come back upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots, and upon their horsemen." Moses, now on the opposite shore, stretched out his hand once more over the sea. It was dawn. The golden light of a rising sun painted the horizon. And in that light it happened. The walls of water began to tremble, first subtly, then violently. Those enormous masses of ocean, held by supernatural power throughout the night, began to yield to the natural pull of gravity. The Egyptians saw it, and they screamed. They tried to run, but where to? They were surrounded. They tried to turn back, but the path was blocked by broken chariots and fallen horses. Some tried to swim, but they were trapped between the falling masses of water. And then, with a roar that must have been heard for miles, the waters fell. It was as if two liquid mountains collapsed at the same time. The sound was deafening, a roar that silenced any human scream. The waters collided in the middle with explosive force, creating a wave that rose dozens of meters into the air before crashing down again. White foam filled the air. The spray was launched so high that it created a temporary rainbow in the dawn light. Cars were crushed like paper. Horses vanished instantly. Soldiers were swallowed by the turbulent waters. The bronze armor that was supposed to protect them became their deathly weight, dragging them to the depths. Within minutes, it was all over. The sea returned to its normal form, its waves breaking normally on the shore, as if nothing had happened. The dark blue surface showed no sign of the road that had been there. No sign of Pharaoh's 600 chosen chariots. No sign of his mighty army. The Bible records with terrifying simplicity, not one of them remained. On the other side, on dry land, Israel was stunned. 2 million people stood silently, processing what they had just witnessed. Some were on their knees. Others had their arms raised to the heavens. Children clung to their mothers. Old men wept openly. Then, as the sun continued to rise in the sky, illuminating the now calm sea, the waves began to bring evidence of the destruction. Pieces of chariots, Egyptian shields, broken spears, empty armor. The bodies of Egyptian soldiers began to appear on the beach, brought in by the tide. Israel saw and understood. Their oppressors were dead. 400 years of slavery had ended definitively. Egypt, the most fearsome military power in the world, had been destroyed in an instant by the power of God. Reverence gripped everyone. It wasn't just relief or joy. It was a sacred, profound awe. They had witnessed the impossible. They had walked on the ocean floor. They had seen the greatest army in the world swallowed by the waters. And they understood with crystal clarity that the God of their fathers was real, powerful, terrible in his majesty. The Bible says, "And Israel saw the great power that the Lord had exercised against the Egyptians, and the people feared the Lord, and believed in the Lord and in Moses his servant." And then, spontaneously, the song began. Moses was the first to raise his voice, and soon the whole nation joined him. Men, women, children, all sang with all their might, their voices rising like incense to the heavens. "I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. He has hurled into the sea both horse and rider. The Lord is my strength and my song. He has become my salvation. This is my God, and I will praise him, my father's God, and I will exalt him." The men danced, leaping with joy, arms raised, feet pounding on the sand. The women took tambourines and panderos they had brought from Egypt and began to play joyful rhythms. Miriam, Moses' sister, led the women in a celebratory dance. The Lord is a warrior. The Lord is his name. He has hurled Pharaoh's chariots and his army into the sea. His chosen captains were submerged in the Red Sea. The depths covered them. They sank to the depths like a stone. The song continued, verse after verse of praise, recapping the miracle, exalting God's power, prophesying the journey ahead. It was a moment of pure adoration, unchoreographed, unrehearsed, springing from the deepest part of the human heart that had just been touched by the divine. Your right hand, O Lord, has been glorified in power. Your right hand, O Lord, has shattered the enemy. In the greatness of your majesty, you have overthrown those who rose up against you. You sent your wrath, which consumed them like stubble. Children ran among the adults, laughing, singing fragments of the song they heard. Elderly people who had been born into slavery and never imagined living to see that day sang with tears streaming down their wrinkled faces, their voices trembling but full of fervor. The sun rose higher and higher. The beach was alive with celebration. And for hours, the people of Israel sang, danced, and praised, celebrating not only their physical liberation, but the fact that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had proven his faithfulness beyond question. On that day, on the shores of the Red Sea, under the bright desert sun, before the waters that had become instruments of salvation and judgment, the people of Israel learned a lesson that would echo through all future generations. There's no sea that God cannot part, no enemy that he cannot defeat, no situation too impossible for his power. The people who had been enslaved for 400 years were now free. Egypt, in a single day, had lost its army and its power. And Israel, even though they had a long journey ahead, 40 years in the desert awaited, now knew who their God was. They had walked through the impossible. They had stepped where no human being should ever step. They had been eyewitnesses to the greatest miracle of liberation in human history. And they would never be the same again. The Red Sea returned to its natural state. Its blue waters broke calmly on the shore. But those waters would forever hold the secret of that extraordinary night when they parted to let God's people pass through and closed to judge their oppressors. And the story of that day would be told and retold throughout the centuries, a story of faith when all seemed lost, of obedience when divine command seemed impossible, of deliverance when there was no visible way out, of a God who fulfills his promises, who hears the cry of the oppressed, who intervenes in human history with unparalleled power. Israel marched into the desert as a free people. And although trials still awaited, although murmuring and rebellion were yet to come, that day would remain etched in the nation's collective memory. The day God parted the sea, the day the impossible became possible, the day slavery ended, and the journey to the promise began. And even today, thousands of years later, the story is told. The story of Moses, of the parting of the Red Sea, and of the God who liberates his people.